The police officer stood blocking the black single father, his voice dripping with contempt. "Stand up, now. This seat isn't yours." Over 50 phones rose into the air, recording every second as Jordan Hale was pressured to leave the first-class seat he had paid for, while his 7-year-old son sobbed, clinging desperately to his leg. No handcuffs, but the public humiliation cut deeper than any wound ever could. When Jordan spoke the words that made the officer laugh with pure disdain, "You're making the biggest mistake of your career," nobody imagined that minutes later, the entire flight would be grounded. But let's rewind to how it all began. Jordan Hale walked through the first-class cabin with his son's small hand wrapped tightly in his. The leather seats gleamed under soft overhead lighting, and the scent of expensive cologne mixed with freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. This was a world Jordan didn't belong to, at least not according to the eyes that followed him down the aisle. He wore a faded gray hoodie, worn sneakers, and carried a backpack that had seen better days. His son Miles, 7 years old with curious eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him, clutched a stuffed elephant against his chest. They looked like passengers who had wandered into the wrong section of the plane. Jordan found their seats, 3A and 3B, and helped Miles settle in by the window. The boy pressed his face against the glass immediately, watching the ground crew load luggage onto the conveyor belt below. "Dad, is this really where we're sitting?" Miles whispered, as if speaking too loudly might get them kicked out. Jordan smiled and adjusted his son's seatbelt. "This is exactly where we're sitting, buddy. I promised you, didn't I?" It had taken Jordan 3 years to save for these tickets. 3 years of skipping lunches, taking extra freelance projects after his regular job as a software engineer, and putting every spare dollar into a savings account he'd labeled Sarah's Promise. His wife had always dreamed of taking Miles to Zurich, to show him the snow-capped Alps, the chocolate shops, the Christmas markets that sparkled like something out of a fairy tale. She'd talked about it constantly during her final months when the cancer had spread too far for the doctors to stop. "When I get better," she'd say, her voice thin but hopeful, "we'll take him there. First class. The whole experience." She never got better. But Jordan had made her a promise, and he intended to keep it. He could have asked Marcus Whitfield for help. The billionaire CEO of Whitfield Aviation had been Jordan's benefactor since college, a scholarship that had changed his life, given to a struggling kid from Baltimore who showed promise in computer science. Marcus had offered Jordan jobs, connections, opportunities that would have fast-tracked him to wealth. Jordan had declined every single one. "I need to earn it myself," he'd told Marcus years ago. "Otherwise, how will I ever know what I'm actually worth?" Marcus had respected that. Their relationship had evolved into something like family. Jordan was invited to holiday dinners, birthday celebrations, the kind of gatherings where Marcus introduced him simply as "my friend Jordan," without any mention of charity or scholarships. But Jordan had never asked for a single favor beyond that initial help with tuition. These first-class tickets were purchased with his own money, every cent. A woman in the aisle seat across from Jordan glanced over, her eyes traveling from his hoodie to his sneakers and back up again. Her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval before she looked away, adjusting her silk scarf as if proximity to him might somehow contaminate it. Jordan pretended not to notice. He'd spent his entire life pretending not to notice. The cabin continued to fill. Business executives in tailored suits. A young couple clearly on their honeymoon, all champagne and whispered laughter. An elderly man with a gold watch that probably cost more than Jordan's car. And then came Beatrice Galloway. She swept into first class like she owned the entire aircraft, her Hermes bag clutched against her chest and her face set in an expression of permanent dissatisfaction. Beatrice was the CEO of Galloway Cosmetics, a company that had once been a household name, but was now hemorrhaging money faster than she could stop it. This trip to Zurich was supposed to save everything. A last-ditch meeting with European investors who might, if she played her cards right, inject enough capital to keep her empire from crumbling. The stress had been eating at her for months. She hadn't slept properly in weeks. And when she saw Jordan Hale sitting in first class, a black man in a hoodie with a child looking utterly out of place, something inside her snapped. Beatrice stopped in the aisle, staring at Jordan as if he were a stain on an otherwise pristine carpet. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying across the cabin. "I think you're in the wrong seat." Jordan looked up, keeping his expression neutral. "I'm sorry? This is first class." Beatrice spoke slowly, as if explaining something to a particularly dim child. "Your seats are probably back there." She gestured vaguely toward the economy section behind the curtain. "These are our seats," Jordan replied calmly. 3A and 3B. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "That's impossible." Before Jordan could respond, she had already turned and was flagging down a flight attendant. Sandra, the senior cabin crew member, approached with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" "Yes, there's a problem," Beatrice pointed at Jordan. "This man is sitting in first class. I don't think he belongs here." Sandra's gaze shifted to Jordan, and something flickered across her face. A judgment made in milliseconds, based on nothing but appearance. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Jordan pulled out his phone and showed her the digital ticket. Sandra studied it for a long moment, her brow furrowed. "And your ID?" Jordan handed over his driver's license. Sandra examined it, glanced back at the ticket, and then at Jordan again. "Sir, I'm going to need to verify this with the gate agent. Would you mind stepping off the plane for a moment?" Miles looked up at his father, confusion and fear beginning to cloud his small face. "Dad? What's happening?" Jordan felt his chest tighten. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, keeping his voice steady for his son's sake. "Can't you verify it here? My ticket is legitimate. I paid for these seats." "I'm sure you did, sir, but there have been issues with fraudulent tickets lately. It's just a precaution." "You haven't asked anyone else to verify their tickets?" Sandra's smile tightened. "Sir, I'm asking you." Beatrice watched the exchange with barely concealed satisfaction. "See? I knew something was off. People like him don't just show up in first class." The words hit Jordan like a slap. People like him. He'd heard variations of that phrase his entire life, and it never got easier. But he forced himself to remain composed. Losing his temper would only make things worse, would only confirm whatever narrative they'd already constructed in their heads. "I'm not leaving my seat," Jordan said quietly. "My son and I have every right to be here." Sandra's expression hardened. "Sir, if you refuse to cooperate, I'll have no choice but to involve security." "Then involve them. Because I'm not moving." By now, other passengers had begun to watch. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact. Others pulled out their phones, sensing that something worth recording was about to unfold. Miles tugged at Jordan's sleeve, his voice small and trembling. "Dad, maybe we should just go. I don't want you to get in trouble." The words broke Jordan's heart. His 7-year-old son, who should have been excited about his first flight in first class, was instead learning a lesson no child should have to learn, that sometimes, no matter what you do, people will see you as less than. Jordan squeezed his son's hand. "We didn't do anything wrong, buddy. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself even when it's hard." Sandra had already stepped away to make a call. Within minutes, a figure appeared at the entrance of the first-class cabin. Officer Miller, airport security, with 20 years on the job and a face that suggested he'd seen it all and was tired of seeing more. Miller approached Jordan with the kind of weary authority that came from dealing with countless situations over the years. He didn't ask questions. He didn't examine the ticket. He simply looked at Jordan, looked at Beatrice, and made his assessment. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me." "I haven't done anything wrong," Jordan said. "My ticket is valid. I paid for this seat." "That's what we need to verify. Now, you can come voluntarily, or I can escort you off this plane. Your choice." Miles began to cry softly, pressing his face against his father's arm. The sound cut through the cabin like a knife. "Please," Jordan said, his voice cracking slightly. "My son is scared. Just check the ticket. It will take 2 minutes." Miller shook his head. "We'll sort it out at the security office. Stand up." Beatrice let out a small laugh. "I told you, people who actually belong in first class don't make scenes like this." Jordan looked at her, then at Miller, then at the dozens of phones now recording every moment of his humiliation. He thought about his wife, about the promise he'd made, about all the years of working twice as hard just to be treated as equal. And then, despite everything, he spoke the words that would change the course of this entire day. "You're making the biggest mistake of your career." Miller laughed, a short, dismissive bark of amusement. "Sure I am. Now stand up, sir. I won't ask again." Jordan rose slowly, keeping Miles close. His son's small body trembled against him, and Jordan had never felt more powerless in his entire life. As he was led toward the exit, he looked back once at the first-class cabin, at Beatrice's smug expression, at Sandra's impassive face, at all the passengers who watched but said nothing. None of them had any idea what was about to happen. The fluorescent lights of the security office hummed overhead as Jordan was led inside. The room was sterile, impersonal. White walls, a metal desk, 2 plastic chairs that looked like they'd been pulled from a high school cafeteria. It smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaning solution. But Jordan barely registered any of it. His mind was still on the plane, on his son's terrified face as Miller had separated them. "My boy stays with me," Jordan had demanded at the aircraft door, his voice rising for the first time. Miller had shaken his head. "The child remains on the plane. Standard procedure. We're not in the business of separating families, but we can't have a minor in the security office during an investigation." "Investigation? What investigation? I bought a ticket." Sandra had stepped forward then, her expression carefully neutral. "I'll personally watch him, sir. He'll be safe. The sooner you cooperate, the sooner this will be resolved." Jordan had looked at Miles, his small body shaking, tears streaming down his cheeks, the stuffed elephant crushed against his chest like a lifeline. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to grab his son and walk off the plane entirely. But he knew how that would end. He'd seen the videos, read the headlines. A black man resisting airport security, even peacefully, rarely ended well. "I'll be right back, buddy," Jordan had said, kneeling down to meet his son's eyes. "I promise. Everything's going to be okay." Miles had nodded, but his eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of a child who was learning, far too young, that the world wasn't always fair. Now, sitting in the security office with Miller standing over him like a guard watching a prisoner, Jordan felt the weight of that moment crushing his chest. "Empty your pockets," Miller ordered. Jordan complied. Phone, wallet, keys. He placed them on the metal desk. "You know," Miller said, picking up the wallet and flipping through it, "I've been doing this job for 20 years. I can spot trouble the moment it walks onto a plane. And you, my friend, had trouble written all over you the second you stepped into first class. Because of how I look." Miller didn't answer directly. People who can actually afford first class don't dress like they're going to a basketball game. They don't bring kids with stuffed animals. They have a certain presence. "So you judge me based on my clothes and my skin color?" "I judged you based on experience." Miller dropped the wallet back on the desk. "And the fact that a respected passenger filed a complaint. Mrs. Galloway has flown with this airline for 15 years. She knows what belongs in first class and what doesn't." Jordan felt anger rising in his throat, but he forced it down. Getting emotional would only give Miller more ammunition. Instead, he focused on what he knew, his rights. "I want to make a phone call," Miller snorted. "This isn't jail, you're not under arrest." "Then I'm free to go." "You're being detained for questioning, which means I have the right to contact someone. That's the law." Miller's eyes narrowed. He clearly hadn't expected pushback, not the calm, informed kind that suggested Jordan knew exactly what he was talking about. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. "Fine," Miller finally said, sliding Jordan's phone across the desk. "Make it quick." Jordan picked up the phone and scrolled through his contacts. His finger hovered over Marcus Whitfield's name. For years, he had refused to leverage this connection, refused to be the kind of person who called in favors from powerful friends. He had wanted to prove, to himself, to his late wife, to the world, that he could stand on his own 2 feet. But this wasn't about him anymore. This was about Miles. He pressed the call button. Marcus answered on the second ring. "Jordan, this is a surprise. Everything all right?" "Not exactly." Jordan kept his voice steady, though his hands wanted to shake. "I'm at the airport. There's been an incident. They pulled me off the plane. Some kind of misunderstanding about my ticket. They're holding me in security." "What? That's absurd. You're flying to Zurich today, right? The 11 o'clock flight?" "That's the one. Listen, I'm not calling to ask you to fix this. I can handle it. But Miles is still on the plane, and I don't know how long this is going to take. If I miss the flight, I need someone to make sure he's okay. Can you—" "Jordan." Marcus's voice had changed. The casual warmth was gone, replaced by something harder, more focused. "Which airline?" "Atlantic Airways." "But Marcus, I don't want you to—" "Which plane? What's the tail number?" "I don't know the tail number. It's Flight 847 departing from Gate B32. There was a brief silence on the other end. Jordan could hear the rapid clicking of a keyboard. "Jordan, that plane is one of mine." "What?" "Atlantic Airways leases several aircraft from Whitfield Aviation. Flight 847 is operating on a plane my company owns." Marcus's voice was ice cold now. "You're telling me that my plane, leased to Atlantic, is currently holding your son while you're being detained by security? Based on what? A complaint from another passenger? A woman named Beatrice Galloway. She decided I didn't look like I belonged in first class." "Stay where you are. Don't say another word to anyone. I'm on my way." "Marcus, I didn't call to—" "I know why you called. You called because you're a good father who puts his son first. But I'm coming anyway. And when I get there, heads are going to roll." The line went dead. Jordan lowered the phone slowly. Miller was watching him with a mixture of suspicion and boredom. "Feel better?" the officer asked. "Called your lawyer?" "Something like that." 30,000 feet of altitude couldn't have prepared anyone for what was happening on the ground and in the digital stratosphere. The videos had started uploading the moment Jordan was let off the plane. Passengers in first class, passengers in economy who had witnessed the confrontation through the gap in the curtain, even crew members who had secretly recorded on their personal devices. Within 20 minutes, the hashtag Justice for Jordan was trending. The clips showed everything: Jordan's calm demeanor, Miles's tears, Beatrice's sneer, Miller's dismissive laugh when Jordan said he was making a mistake. The internet, that great equalizer of outrage, had found its villain of the day, and Atlantic Airways was scrambling to respond. In the airline's corporate headquarters, phones were ringing off the hook. The PR team was drafting statements that would never be released. Executives were calling emergency meetings. And somewhere in the chain of command, someone had made a very bad decision. Back on the plane, Sandra was trying to keep Miles calm. The boy sat in his seat, alone now, his eyes fixed on the door through which his father had disappeared. Other passengers glanced at him with expressions ranging from pity to indifference. Beatrice Galloway had returned to her seat and was sipping champagne, looking thoroughly pleased with herself. "See?" she said to the woman across the aisle, the same woman who had given Jordan that look of disapproval when he first boarded. "I knew he was trouble. People like that always cause problems. They see something nice and they think they can just take it." The woman nodded uncomfortably, but said nothing. Sandra approached the cockpit and spoke quietly to the captain. "Sir, we're getting calls from corporate. There's some kind of situation developing on social media. They want to know if we can expedite departure." The captain frowned. "We're still waiting on final clearance." "I know, but given the circumstances, maybe we should push for an earlier slot. Get in the air before this gets worse." It was a bad idea, born of panic and the desperate hope that problems left on the ground might somehow stay there. The captain should have refused. Instead, he picked up the radio. "Tower, this is Atlantic 847 requesting priority departure clearance." The plane began to taxi. Miles pressed his face against the window, watching the terminal grow smaller. His father was somewhere in that building, and the plane was moving away from him. The boy's lower lip trembled, but he didn't cry. He was too scared to cry. The aircraft had just turned onto the taxiway when the radio crackled to life. "Atlantic 847, this is Tower. You are instructed to return to gate immediately. Repeat, return to gate B32 immediately." The captain's face went pale. "Tower, can you confirm? We have departure clearance." "Clearance is rescinded. Return to gate immediately. This is not a request." In the cabin, passengers began murmuring. Sandra's phone buzzed, a message from the airline's operations center that made her blood run cold. "What is it?" her colleague asked. Sandra's voice was barely a whisper. "Marcus Whitfield just called the CEO directly. He's threatening to terminate the entire fleet lease agreement if this plane takes off." The name meant nothing to most passengers, but to anyone who knew the airline industry, Marcus Whitfield was a titan. His company owned hundreds of aircraft leased to carriers around the world. A single phone call from him could ground an entire airline. Beatrice Galloway looked up from her champagne, frowning. "Why are we turning around? What's happening?" Nobody answered her. Marcus Whitfield's black sedan pulled up to the airport security entrance exactly 18 minutes after he'd ended the call with Jordan. He didn't wait for his driver to open the door. He was out of the car and moving before the vehicle had fully stopped, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the pavement with the rhythm of a man who was about to end someone's career. He found the security office without difficulty. A lifetime of building airports and terminals had given him an intimate knowledge of their layouts. When he pushed open the door, the scene before him confirmed every fear he'd had during the drive over. Jordan sat in a plastic chair, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of barely contained frustration. Miller stood over him, arms crossed, radiating the kind of petty authority that small men clung to when they had nothing else. "Mr. Whitfield." The security supervisor, who had trailed behind Marcus, spoke up nervously. "Sir, I wasn't aware you were—" "Of course you weren't." Marcus didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on Miller. "Officer, I'd like to see the documentation for this detention." Miller straightened, clearly caught off guard by the arrival of a man in a $3,000 suit who spoke with the casual authority of someone who owned things. "And you are?" "Marcus Whitfield. I own the plane that Mr. Hale was just removed from." The color drained from Miller's face. "I'd also like to know," Marcus continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, "whether you verified Mr. Hale's ticket before detaining him, whether you checked his identification, whether you followed any of the standard protocols that are supposed to protect innocent passengers from exactly this kind of treatment." Miller's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. "Because from what I understand, you took one look at this man, a software engineer, a father, a man who paid full price for those first-class seats, and you decided, based on nothing but his appearance, that he didn't belong." Marcus took a step closer. You saw a black man in a hoodie and you made a judgment, didn't you? There was a complaint? From a passenger who has no authority to determine who does or doesn't belong on my aircraft. A passenger whose opinion you treated as gospel while treating Mr. Hale like a criminal. Marcus's voice finally hardened. I want your badge number. I want the name of your supervisor. And I want you to understand that by the time I'm done, you will never work in airport security again. Jordan stood up slowly. Marcus, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Marcus turned to face him, and for a moment, his expression softened. You've spent years refusing my help because you wanted to prove you could make it on your own. And you have. You've built a life, raised an incredible son, honored your wife's memory in ways that humble me. But sometimes, Jordan, accepting help isn't weakness. Sometimes it's just letting people who care about you stand beside you when the world tries to knock you down. He turned back to Miller, the softness gone. Now, where is his son? Gate B-32 had transformed into a circus. News crews had arrived, their cameras forming a wall of lenses pointed at the aircraft that sat motionless on the tarmac. Social media influencers live-streamed from their phones. Airport security struggled to maintain order as curious travelers gathered to witness whatever was unfolding. Marcus walked through the crowd with Jordan at his side, and the sea of people parted before them. Nobody knew exactly who Marcus was, but power has a way of announcing itself without words. The plane's door opened, and passengers began filing out, confused, frustrated, demanding explanations that nobody could give them. Sandra stood at the exit, her face ashen, directing people toward the gate with mechanical efficiency. And then Jordan saw him. Miles burst through the crowd of deplaning passengers, his stuffed elephant forgotten somewhere behind him, his small legs carrying him as fast as they could go. Jordan dropped to his knees just in time to catch his son in an embrace so tight it seemed like he might never let go. Dad! Miles buried his face in his father's chest, his whole body shaking. They said you weren't coming back. They said, I'm here, buddy. I'm right here. Jordan's voice cracked, and he didn't try to hide it. I'm not going anywhere. The cameras captured everything. The reunion, the tears, the image of a father holding his son in the middle of an airport terminal, surrounded by chaos but somehow existing in their own private world of relief and love. Marcus watched the scene with an expression that might have been mistaken for stone if you didn't know him. But those who did would have recognized the subtle clench of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. He was furious, not the explosive kind of fury that burns hot and fast, but the cold, calculating kind that destroys careers and dismantles empires. Beatrice Galloway emerged from the aircraft, looking thoroughly bewildered. Her earlier smugness had evaporated somewhere over the past hour, replaced by a growing sense that something had gone terribly wrong. When she saw the news cameras, her confusion deepened. What is happening? She demanded of no one in particular. Why are we back at the gate? I have a meeting in Zurich that I absolutely cannot miss. Marcus stepped forward. Mrs. Galloway. His voice carried across the gate area, cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. I believe we need to have a conversation. Beatrice turned, her eyes scanning Marcus with the automatic assessment of a businesswoman sizing up a potential competitor. And you are? Marcus Whitfield. I own the aircraft you were just sitting in. The blood drained from Beatrice's face so quickly that for a moment, Jordan thought she might faint. I also own, Marcus continued, Whitfield Hospitality Group, 63 hotels across North America and Europe. Your company, Galloway Cosmetics, isn't it, has been in negotiations with my procurement team for the past 8 months, a contract to supply amenities to our entire chain. It would have been worth approximately $40 million over 5 years. Beatrice's mouth moved, but no sound came out. That contract is terminated, effective immediately. The words landed like hammer blows. Beatrice staggered backward, her hand reaching for something to steady herself. You can't. That contract was going to save my company. The investors in Zurich were waiting for that confirmation before they— You should have thought about that before you decided that a man's skin color determined whether he belonged in first class. Marcus's voice never rose above a conversational tone, which somehow made it more devastating. You are also permanently banned from any flight operating aircraft owned by Whitfield Aviation. Given that we lease to 14 different airlines worldwide, I suggest you get comfortable with trains. Beatrice's face crumpled. Not with remorse, not yet, but with the sudden crushing realization that her world had just collapsed. The trip that was supposed to save everything had destroyed everything instead. She sank into a nearby chair, her designer bag falling to the floor unnoticed. Jordan watched her fall apart, and he expected to feel satisfaction. He had every right to feel satisfied. This woman had tried to humiliate him, had traumatized his son, had set into motion a chain of events that could have ended far worse than it did. But all he felt was emptiness. Marcus turned to address the gathered crowd. Passengers, crew members, journalists, curious onlookers. On behalf of myself and Whitfield Aviation, I want to publicly apologize to Jordan Hale and his son Miles. What happened today was inexcusable. A man was removed from his rightful seat, separated from his child, and treated like a criminal, all because of assumptions based on his appearance. The crew members involved will be suspended pending a full investigation. This flight is canceled. All passengers will receive full refunds and complimentary rebooking on the next available flight. The cameras ate it up. Tomorrow, this would be the lead story on every news network in America. Marcus Whitfield, billionaire CEO, standing up against racism. Jordan Hale, the everyman hero who refused to back down. It was a perfect narrative, wrapped up with a bow. Except it wasn't perfect at all. As the crowd began to disperse and airline officials scrambled to implement Marcus's directives, several first-class passengers approached Jordan. These were the same people who had watched in silence as he was escorted off the plane. The woman with the silk scarf, the elderly man with the gold watch, the honeymooning couple who had been too wrapped up in each other to care about anything else. I just want you to know, the woman said, extending her hand. I thought what happened to you was terrible, just terrible. Jordan looked at her hand for a long moment before shaking it. His grip was brief, his expression polite but distant. Thank you. We were going to say something, the elderly man added, but everything happened so fast, and we didn't want to make the situation worse. Jordan nodded. I understand. He didn't understand. They had sat there, silent and comfortable, while a child cried for his father. They had watched injustice unfold and chosen the safety of non-involvement, and now they wanted absolution without having earned it. Jordan didn't give it to them. He simply turned away and walked toward Marcus, Miles's hand clasped firmly in his own. The private jet was smaller than Jordan had imagined, only 8 seats, arranged in facing pairs around polished wood tables. The leather was softer than anything he'd ever touched, the cabin silent except for the gentle hum of engines preparing for departure. Miles had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the ordeal. His head rested against Jordan's shoulder, his breathing slow and even. The stuffed elephant, retrieved by a remorseful Sandra before they left the terminal, was tucked under his arm. Marcus sat across from them, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table before him. He hadn't spoken since they boarded. Neither had Jordan. Finally, as the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Jordan broke the silence. Thank you for what you did today. Marcus waved a hand dismissively. It was the least I could do. What happened to you was— I know, and I'm grateful. But I need you to understand something. Jordan looked down at his sleeping son, then back at Marcus. Today I got justice because I happened to know you. Because the man who humiliated me picked the wrong airline on the wrong day. But there are millions of people who look like me who don't know a Marcus Whitfield. They don't have a billionaire on speed dial. When they get pulled off planes, when they get followed in stores, when they get stopped by police for driving nice cars, nobody comes to rescue them. Marcus was silent. I don't want my son growing up thinking that the only way to be treated like a human being is to know someone powerful. That's not justice. That's just luck wearing a different mask. The plane lifted off, climbing steadily into clouds that glowed orange with the setting sun. Marcus stared out the window for a long time before responding. "You're right." His voice was quieter than Jordan had ever heard it. "I can write checks to change what happened today. I can ban people and cancel contracts and make speeches that go viral, but I can't change the fact that this keeps happening, that it will keep happening. No, you can't. Nobody can do it alone." Jordan shifted slightly, careful not to wake Miles. "But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is that we keep trying anyway. We keep standing up. We keep teaching our kids to stand up. And maybe someday they won't have to." Miles stirred in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Jordan pulled him closer. "He asked me something earlier," Jordan said softly. "When we were waiting at the gate, he asked me why they hate him." Marcus's expression tightened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him they don't hate him. They just haven't learned to see people with their hearts yet." Jordan smoothed his son's hair absently. "I don't know if that's true, but I need him to believe it. At least for a little while longer." The plane broke through the clouds, emerging into a sky painted with streaks of purple and gold. Below, the world continued to turn. Unfair, complicated, beautiful, and broken in equal measure. Jordan pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window. He had won today. His son was safe. They were on their way to Zurich to see the snow-capped Alps and the chocolate shops and the Christmas markets that Sarah had dreamed about. But victory felt hollow when he knew it was built on privilege most people would never have. He had fought, yes. He had refused to back down. But in the end, it was Marcus's power, not Jordan's courage, that had turned the tide. Someday, he hoped, that would change. Someday, standing up for yourself would be enough. Someday, a father wouldn't need to know the right people to protect his son from humiliation. Until then, all Jordan could do was hold Miles close and promise himself that he would raise a boy who never stopped fighting. Not for revenge, not for victory, but for a world where no child would ever have to ask why people hated him for the color of his skin. The jet climbed higher, carrying them toward a future that remained unwritten. Jordan squeezed his son's hand and watched the horizon stretch endlessly before them. The battle was over. The war continued.